David Ricardo's chapter 25 on colonial trade in his 1817 work on the principles of political economy and taxation stands as one of the most rigorous early 19th century examinations of imperial commerce through the lens of classical political economy. Although it appears at first glance to be a continuation of Adam Smith's critique of mercantile system, Ricardo's treatment is more analytically severe and more internally consistent and more deeply integrated into his general theory of value distribution and international trade. This chapter is not merely a comment on colonial injustice, it is an attempt to reconcile the phenomenon of colonial monopoly with universal laws governing natural price, profits, and the distribution of precious metals. In doing so, Ricardo moves beyond moral denunciation and subjects empire itself to the discipline of economic law. Ricardo begins by acknowledging Adam Smith's achievement in demonstrating the injustice of colonial restrictions and superiority of free trade. Smith had shown that preventing colonies from selling their produce in the dearest hours in the dearest market and buying in the cheapest was a violation of the natural liberty of commerce. Ricardo accepts this as established. However, he finds Smith's demonstrations such as restrictions are injurious to the mother countries less satisfactory. The distinction is crucial. Ricardo's aim is not to rehearse the moral argument but to investigate whether, under certain circumstances, the mother country might indeed benefit from colonial restraints. He therefore poses a deliberately provocative question: may not a mother country sometimes gain from imposing restrictions upon its colonies? By raising this possibility, he signals that the issue must be examined in terms of transfers, prices, and capital allocation rather than sentiment. To illuminate the question, Ricardo constructs a hypothetical reversal. Suppose England were a colony of France. France compelled England to grant a bounty on exports of corn or cloth. In earlier chapters, Ricardo had analyzed export bounties, demonstrated that such policies after the relative prices of goods between countries by um, demonstrated that alter demonstrated that such policies alter the relative price of goods between countries, affecting the distribution of money. If corn were £4 per quarter in England and a bounty of 10 shillings were paid on export, the effective price of corn in France would fall. French consumers would benefit from cheaper grain. The entire amount of bounty paid by England would effectively accrue to France. France would gain not merely a portion of England's loss, but the whole of it. The logic is stark. A country can benefit from another's loss when the policy compels a transfer, yet this benefit is not the creation of additional wealth. It is a distribution effected through artificial means. The gain arises from distortion, not productivity. Ricardo then shifts from explicit bounties to a more subtle mechanism of colonial monopoly. If Jamaica and Holland would naturally trade directly, but Jamaica is forced to send its produce to England and to receive Dutch goods through English intermediaries, English capital and agency become imposed in a trade in which they would otherwise have no role. England doesn't necessarily pay a bounty for its treasury. Instead, it inserts itself as a compulsory middleman. The bounty is effectively paid by Jamaica and Holland in the form of higher costs or foregone opportunities. This arrangement may generate profit for English merchants, but it again doesn't increase the total produce of the world. It merely relocates gains by imposing a less efficient distribution of capital and labor. Ricardo strengthens his case by invoking Adam Smith's own analysis to commercial treaties. Smith had observed that when one nation is guaranteed exclusive privilege in another market, its merchants enjoy a kind of monopoly and may sell their goods at better prices than under universal competition. Ricardo accepts this logic but pushes it further. If the treaty is between a mother country and its colony, Smith's reasoning implies that the mother country can benefit from the oppression of its colony. Ricardo thus exposes a tension within Smith's account. The possibility of gain from monopoly doesn't contradict the injustice of the system, but it complicates the claim that the mother country necessarily suffers from its own restrictions. Ricardo's project is to show how such apparent gain operates within the broader framework of price determination and capital allocation. At this point, the argument becomes more technical. Ricardo emphasizes that under conditions of competition, gold are sold at their natural prices, determined by the cost of production. Even if a mother country enjoys exclusive access to the colonial market, its merchants cannot indefinitely sell above natural price because competition among domestic producers restrains them. The advantage of monopoly doesn't consist in charging higher prices than natural price, but securing a market that might otherwise be inaccessible due to competitive advantage. If England is granted exclusive access to the French cloth market, it may export cloth, even though another country could produce cloth more cheaply. However, this occurs only because the treaty excludes the more efficient competitor. The monopoly thus permits a less productive allocation of capital to persist. Ricardo introduces a further layer of analysis by examining how trade balances are settled through movements of money. Suppose England wishes to export £5,000 worth of French wine. If it cannot export goods profitably due to competition, it may initially export money to pay for the wine. This export of money reduces the domestic supply of specie, raising the value of money in England and lowering domestic prices. Simultaneously, the influx of money into France raises French prices. Over time, this price adjustment restores England's competitiveness in exports. The mechanism demonstrates that trade flows are governed by adjustments in the distribution of precious metals and the consequent changes in natural prices. Artificial restrictions may alter the path of adjustment, but they cannot escape the underlying monetary logic. Trade continues, whether fettered or free, because price movements re-establish equilibrium. The monetary adjustment process has important implications for colonial trade. If monopoly privileges allow England to export a particular commodity to a colony, the export of money that would otherwise have occurred is reduced. However, the overall distribution of capital is altered in a less productive direction. Capital might have been employed in industries where England possessed genuine competitive advantage, is instead tied up in sectors sustained by artificial privileges. The result is a lower output of commodities and a higher natural price. Consumers, though able to spend the same money value, obtain fewer goods. The apparent gain from monopoly is offset by diminishing productivity of the system as a whole. Ricardo's insistence that cost of production, not demand, regulates long-term relative value reinforces this conclusion. He criticizes John Baptist Say for conflating price with the proportion of supply to demand. For Ricardo, temporary fluctuation in market price may arise from demand shifts, but the real and ultimate regulator of relative value is the cost of production. Colonial restrictions may alter quantities exchanged or the later direction of trade, but they do not overturn the fundamental determinant of value. Price adjustments to reflect labor and capital requirements, mediated by the distribution of money. Thus, even the most elaborate imperial preference system cannot be permanently overridden by the logic of production costs. The chapter also revisits Adam Smith's claim that monopoly of colonial trade raised the general rate of profit in Britain and thereby increased prices, harming competitiveness, and Ricardo disputes the notion that a shift from one foreign trade to another can permanently affect the rate of profit. Profits tend to equalize across sectors as capital flows in search of the highest return. Monopoly may change the direction of capital and distort its allocation, but it doesn't alter the underlying forces that determine profit rates. If profits were raised in one sector due to exclusive privileges, capital would flow until the rate turned into its normal level. Any sustained elevation of profits would imply a structural change in the cost and conditions of production, not merely a commercial restriction. In the final sections, Ricardo addresses the relationship between profits, wages, and prices. He questions Smith's suggestions that high profits contribute to higher prices. Since prices are regulated by the quantity of labor required for production, variation in wages and profits alter the distribution of income between classes but do not necessarily change relative values. A monopoly that raises profit doesn't automatically raise prices unless it affects the cost of production. The key harm of colonial monopolies lies not in inflating prices through high profits but in delivering capital from its most productive employments. The system produces less than it otherwise would have under free trade, and the diminishing output manifests as higher natural prices. Ricardo's ultimate conclusion is unequivocal. The general benefit of society is never so fully secured as by a universally free trade. Colonial restrictions may generate transfers favorable to the mother country, but these gains are achieved through distortions and are accompanied by a less productive distribution of labor and capital. The world's wealth is maximized when country is permitted to employ its industry where it is most advantageous. Empire, when sustained by commercial monopoly, substitutes coercion for efficiency and privilege for comparative advantage. It may enrich particular merchants or manufacturers, but it reduces the aggregate produce available for consumption. In chapter 23, therefore, Ricardo integrates his theory of value, his analysis of money flows, and his doctrine of comparative advantage into a comprehensive critique of colonial trade. He doesn't deny that a mother country can extract advantage from a colony. Rather, he insists that such advantages represent a redistribution within a diminished total. The laws governing natural prices and the distribution of precious metal reassert themselves regardless of political arrangements. Free trade is not presented as a moral aspiration but as economic condition where under which capital is most productively allocated and global wealth is greatest. Colonial monopoly, by contrast, is shown to be an economically inferior system that sacrifices efficiency for the illusion of control.